In certain relationships, your simple decision to withdraw is enough to provoke a deep crisis in the other. There was no betrayal. There were no screams. You simply chose to step back. You chose silence, distance, autonomy. And yet, the other collapses. Anger, panic, accusations, despair. As if your absence had ripped out some fundamental piece from their soul. This disproportionate reaction has an explanation. And it is not rational, it is psychic. Carl Jung teaches us that in many bonds, especially those guided by unconscious forces, you are not seen as an individual, but as a symbol, a projection. The other mentally shapes you to occupy a specific role within their emotional structure. You become what they need, a mother who nurtures, a father who protects, a mirror that validates, a support that keeps everything standing. And that is exactly why, when you leave, what collapses is not just the relationship. It is the illusion. It is the unconscious support that you represented. You were not just you. You were their emotional balance. John Bowlby's attachment theory, along with Mary Ainsworth's research, shows us how many build emotional bonds marked by a constant fear of abandonment. People with anxious attachment live on alert. For them, your presence is synonymous with stability. Your predictability is what prevents anxiety from overflowing. When you break this pattern, what shatters is not the affection. It is the structure that kept the emotional chaos contained. And Margaret Mahler describes this moment as a forced birth. Because when the symbiotic bond is broken, the other's psyche is forcibly pushed into the perception of separation, of individuality, something that may have never been fully developed. For those who have lived fused with the other, emotionally, symbolically, or unconsciously, separation is not a goodbye. It is an amputation. You did not leave just as a person. You left as a psychic function, as a mirror, as support, as emotional sustenance, and that is why the other collapses. Throughout this video, we will deeply analyze this phenomenon. With Jung, we will understand the role of projections and archetypes in relationships. With Bowlby and Ainsworth, we will dive into the dynamics of anxious attachment. And with Mahler, we will reveal how separation can touch on primitive childhood wounds. All of this so that you understand a hard but necessary truth. The other's despair is not always proof of love. Often, it is just fear. Fear of facing their own emptiness without you as a shield. If you have ever been accused of selfishness for simply wanting to be free, if you have ever felt guilty for prioritizing your peace, if you have ever realized that the problem was never you, but what you represented for the other, then this video is your mirror. Carl Jung said that we are all born originals, but we die copies. Not because we lose our individuality throughout life, but because, without realizing it, we transform into what others expect, and we expect the same from them. In many relationships, what we call love is nothing more than an unconscious game of projections. You do not relate to the other as they truly are. You relate to the image you have constructed of them. And the most unsettling part, the other does the same with you. In the unconscious, you are shaped as an archetypal figure. Jung called this symbolic functions, universal internal representations that reside in the collective unconscious and are projected onto everyday figures. Thus, you may occupy, without realizing it, the role of the nurturing mother, the saving father, the hero, the caregiver, the spiritual guide, or even the shadow, the one who carries what the other cannot bear to see in themselves. The human mind, especially the wounded mind, cannot endure the chaos of emptiness. So it creates. It assigns meanings, even if false, to maintain a sense of internal order. And you, by entering someone's life, can become that order. Your presence calms, because it represents protection. Your listening validates because it represents acceptance. Your silence hurts because it is interpreted as rejection of the idealized figure and not as a gesture of yours. And here lies the most critical point. The more the other is disconnected from themselves, the more they will need you to fill what is lacking. They will place you on an invisible pedestal, but not to admire you, to use you as a foundation. And every foundation, when removed, causes the structure to collapse. Therefore, when you decide to distance yourself, what crumbles is not just the emotional bond. It is the unconscious fantasy that the other constructed about you. They do not miss who you are. They miss the function you fulfilled, the emotional stability that your presence represented. And when that function disappears, despair arises, not because they lost you, but because they lost the internal ground they projected onto you. This symbolic dynamic strengthens in people who have not yet faced their own shadows. Jung warned that the process of individuation, the path to becoming who you truly are, requires looking inward, integrating the shadow, and abandoning projections. But many flee from this process. It is easier to find in the other what one does not want to face in oneself. It is at this point that attachment psychology comes into play. Because when the symbolic projection aligns with an anxious attachment pattern, the bond is not just symbolic, it is vital. The other not only idealizes you, they need you to survive emotionally. And this is exactly what we will discuss in the next part. What happens when symbolic idealization meets the fear of abandonment? What happens when you are both archetype and anchor? Get ready to dive into the unstable terrain of anxious attachment. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. When we talk about attachment, we are not just talking about affection. We are talking about emotional survival. According to John Bowlby, the creator of attachment theory, from the earliest years of life, our brain develops relational patterns that shape how we bond with others. And these patterns are not random. They arise from the repetition of emotional experiences that have left deep marks on the psyche. For those who grew up with unstable bonds, emotional neglect, or affective unpredictability, love always comes with a suffocating fear, the fear of being abandoned. This is the territory of anxious attachment, a dynamic in which the bond with the other is experienced as a lifeline. The anxious person does not love lightly, they love urgently. They do not relate to the other, they cling to them as an extension of their own nervous system. They need the other to regulate themselves, to calm down, to validate their existence. The presence of the other acts as a buffer against anguish, and any sign of distance, real or imagined, is interpreted as a threat of abandonment. Mary Ainsworth, Bowlby's collaborator and a pioneer in empirical studies on attachment, clearly observed this in her research known as the strange situation. Children with anxious attachment would enter true panic when the attachment figure left the room, even for a few minutes. They would cry, become disorganized, and when the caregiver returned, they would show a mix of need for contact and anger. This behavior does not disappear with age. It transforms. Anxious adults repeat the same pattern. They alternate between an intense search for closeness and an often unconscious emotional demand that the other be always available, always responsive, always present. Now think about what happens when you, even unknowingly, become that attachment figure for someone like this. You become the external regulator of that person's internal chaos. Your predictability is what gives meaning to their days. Your presence is what calms their chronic anxiety. You become, for them, what the caregiver should have been in childhood, an emotional pillar, a refuge, an antidote against the fear of being left. But this place is not a space of love. It is a place of entrapment. Because at the slightest sign of autonomy on your part, their system goes into alarm. When you need space, they feel rejection. When you go silent, they hear abandonment. When you pull away, even for personal protection, they interpret it as an attack. And the response may come in the form of desperation, manipulation, emotional blackmail, or explosive anger. This is where the connection with Jung intensifies. The anxious person projects onto you not just a symbolic figure, they project salvation. And when you leave, you do not just disappoint, you destroy the illusion of security. The collapse is not about what happened between you. It is about what the other never managed to build within themselves, a sense of internal security. And it is precisely at this point that Margaret Mahler provides an essential key to understanding this pain. Because for many, your departure is not just a loss. It is a trauma, a psychic cut that dates back to early childhood, a rupture that activates wounds so primitive that the other can barely name what they feel. The psychologist and psychoanalyst Margaret Mahler dedicated her life to understanding how a human being truly becomes an individual, and what she discovered is as disturbing as it is revealing. Many adults we see today who are emotionally dependent, disorganized in the face of separation, or desperate in the face of another's autonomy, are in fact children who never completed the separation-individuation process. For Mahler, psychological birth does not occur at the same moment as biological birth. One thing is to leave the womb. Another, much more complex, is to emerge from the symbiotic fusion with the maternal figure. Whether that figure is the mother, a caregiver, or later, an emotional partner. In the first months of life, the child does not perceive itself as a separate being. It lives in a state of symbiosis. The mother and the child are one. There is no I and other. There is only an undifferentiated affective field where the presence of the mother is the continuity of the child's own existence. This state of fusion is natural at the beginning of life, but it needs to be gradually broken. This is what allows for the development of individuality, emotional autonomy, and the capacity to be alone. The problem is that, in many cases, this breaking does not happen as it should. Early traumas, insecure attachments, inconsistent caregivers, all of this can interrupt or distort this process. The child grows up not truly knowing where it ends and where the other begins. And what it does not integrate in childhood, it transfers to relationships in adulthood. This is where everything connects. When you become the symbiotic other for someone who has never emotionally differentiated, your presence becomes part of that person's sense of identity. You are the ground, the outline, the psychic extension. And when you decide to distance yourself, whether out of personal need, exhaustion, or simply realizing that the relationship has become toxic, you are not just leaving, you are forcing a psychic birth. You are tearing the other away from a primitive illusion of unity. You are saying, we are not one. And this, for someone living in a symbiotic identity, is unbearable. Mahler called this experience forced birth. The person panics not because they love you in essence, but because they feel psychologically torn apart by your absence. It is a cry of childhood despair echoing within an adult body. It is the symbiotic child saying, "Don't leave me alone. I don't know who I am without you." The intensity of the pain comes from the intensity of the fusion. The more fused the other was to you, the more brutal the impact of your absence will be. And this is exactly what leads us to the next part. Because when you finally distance yourself and break this symbiotic bond, what also breaks is the illusion of control that the other exerted over you. And in the face of collapse, the reaction is born. Manipulation, anger, blackmail, attempts at restoration at any cost. Every symbiotic relationship carries within it an essential illusion that the other belongs to us, that they owe us something: time, presence, predictability, unconditional emotional loyalty. But what lies behind this fantasy of belonging is an unconscious attempt at control. And when you start to distance yourself, when you begin to set boundaries, when you start to say no, it is this invisible system of control that begins to crumble. People who live in symbiotic relationships or are marked by anxious attachment often have not learned to self-regulate. They depend on the other to maintain an appearance of emotional stability. And when that other decides to deviate from the script, break the predictability, seek their individuality, the psyche of these people interprets the gesture as betrayal, abandonment, destruction. That is why the reaction to your autonomy often seems disproportionate. Your absence is not understood as your right, but as a personal attack. As if by distancing yourself, you are deliberately causing pain. And here, a dangerous pattern manifests: the need to restore control at any cost. This can happen directly through demands, accusations, emotional blackmail, or in a more subtle way, with manipulative silences, strategic victimhood, moral inversions where you're accused of selfishness for simply wanting to preserve yourself. The anger that arises is not about you. It is about what you represent. The breaking of an unspoken psychic pact. The breaking of the illusion that you would always be there, available, constant. Carl Jung warns us that where power reigns, love is absent. And in this type of relationship, power takes the place of freedom. Love becomes a tool of control. Care turns into manipulation. The bond ceases to be a meeting between two whole beings and transforms into an emotional prison where only one can breathe at a time. This type of dynamic is, in essence, a form of emotional colonization. The other is not truly interested in who you are, but in what you do for them, in the symbolic place you occupy. And like every colony that decides to liberate itself, your autonomy will be treated as a threat, not as evolution. Because while you were predictable, you were useful. But now that you are aware, now that you want to leave, now that you have chosen freedom, you become dangerous. It is at this moment that many turn back. They feel guilt. They allow themselves to be captured by the pain of the other. They give up their own independence to avoid hurting anyone else. But it is important to understand, the other is not hurt by you. They are hurt by the loss of control. They are hurt because they do not know who they are without your presence as an emotional crutch. And you cannot continue to nullify yourself to sustain a structure that should be the other's responsibility. In the next part, we will delve deeper into this truth. Your absence does not cause pain because you were loved, but because you sustained what the other did not want to face. We will talk about the void, the existential hole that opens when the mirror disappears, and why, deep down, this collapse was never about you. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebook, Beyond the Shadow. It breaks down Jung's core ideas and gives you tools to understand yourself more deeply. Link is in the pinned comment. There comes a point when you need to face one of the most liberating and at the same time most painful truths about certain relationships. The problem was never you. The intensity of the other person's pain, no matter how real it seems, is not a reflection of the depth of love, but of the depth of dependency. And this is a crucial distinction. Genuine love recognizes individuality, respects cycles, understands limits. Dependency, on the other hand, demands possession, demands continuity, demands that the other never changes. When you decide to grow, to leave, to breathe, dependency screams. It accuses, pleads, manipulates, all to bring you back to the place where you were, the place of borrowed stability. And it is at this point that many get confused. The other person's pain, when you distance yourself, can be so intense, so dramatic, that you start to doubt yourself. You begin to wonder if you are too harsh, too selfish, insensitive. But that guilt is not yours. It was manufactured from the distortion of a bond that from the beginning was not built on your truth, but on the other person's need. Your freedom is not cruelty, it is a right. And often it is also an act of self-love. When someone collapses because you left, what is coming to the surface is the void you occupied, an internal space that the other never learned to fill on their own. You were not loved for who you were, but for what you represented. You were the sedative, the mirror, the solid ground. Your departure unveils what has always been there, but hidden: chronic insecurity, fear of loneliness, psychic helplessness. And sometimes, it is only when you leave that the other realizes how much they have lost themselves and how much they expected you to fix that. This does not mean you are to blame for that void. It simply means you can no longer sacrifice yourself to fill it. No relationship is fair when it requires you to deny your individuality to keep the other emotionally whole. It is a zero-sum game. Either you nullify yourself or the other reorganizes. And reorganizing hurts, but it is necessary. Your absence may be the beginning of the other's true maturation process, if they have the courage to face that mirror. And it is precisely about this mirror that we will talk next. Because the collapse the other experiences upon losing you is not just an emotional crisis, it is a revelation, a painful and raw chance to look inward and finally see themselves without projections. In the next part, we will discuss the process of individuation according to Jung, and why emotional freedom is not a privilege, but an essential step to becoming who you truly are. Being free has a price, and it's not small. Because when you decide to become whole, when you choose to withdraw from relationships that trap you in symbolic roles, when you start to say, "I am not what you need me to be," you awaken in the other not only frustration but fury, despair, and above all, projection of guilt. You become accused of abandonment, coldness, insensitivity. But all of this is the other's attempt to keep alive an illusion that you were responsible for the stability they never built within themselves. The decision to break away from symbiotic ties is one of the most courageous acts someone can commit, because it requires not only strength to leave, but resilience not to return. Resilience to guilt, resilience to manipulation, resilience to the emotional appeal of someone who, consciously or not, will do everything to restore the symbiosis you broke. And this is where most give up. They backtrack. They negotiate their autonomy for superficial peace. But the truth is that this peace doesn't last, because it's not based on mutual respect, but on emotional control. Carl Jung said that the goal of life is not to be good, nor to be accepted, but to become who you are. And this process, which he called individuation, requires ruptures. It requires confronting the shadow. It requires stepping out of the role that others project onto you. And there's no way to traverse this path without causing discomfort in those who were used to controlling you, defining you, using you as support. Your autonomy is, for many, a cruel reminder that they still don't have their own. But that is not your responsibility. You didn't come into the world to function as anyone's emotional foundation. You weren't born to be the ground for people who refuse to learn to walk on their own. Your mission is different: to discover who you are beneath all the masks, roles, and expectations. It is to live the truth of your soul, even if it displeases, even if it breaks the bonds, because the ties that do not survive your truth were never love. They were a contract, and contracts can and should be broken when they cost your integrity. If this video made you think, if you saw yourself in any of these dynamics, felt that tightness in your chest, for recognizing a story that is, or was, yours, then write in the comments, "I choose to be whole." Say this to yourself. Declare this decision, not to the world, but to the part of you that still feels guilty for stepping away. This choice can be the first step of a profound transformation, and don't stop here. The next video may bring an important reflection. It continues this journey. It deepens this rupture. Keep watching, because those who are awake do not go back to sleep.